Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on early lessons learned from SIRS in home services. My name is Janet Anderson, I am the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner and I'm chairing today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting around Australia and pay my respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us today for the webinar. Now, we have a trio of panellists joining us for discussion today about early lessons learned from the introduction of the SIRS Incident Response Scheme into home services. Anne Wunsch and Dr. Melanie Wroth are with us from the Commission, and Mark Backhouse, who is the Manager of Quality and Compliance in Catholic Homes, is also sharing the stage and will share with us some of his experiences as a provider in the introduction of SIRS Incident Response Scheme into the services for which he's responsible. Now, today is our second in a series of webinars that we're holding this year, and it is being recorded and will be available on our website for viewing shortly after today. Our intention is to host webinars for providers every third Tuesday of the month, and we hope to keep to that time so that you can put it in your diary and predictably mark out this time and join us in successive months. But we will certainly be putting those dates in a calendar on our website. The next webinar will be on Tuesday, the 18th of April, if you want to put that in now. And as I say, the full webinar program with the diverse array of topics that we're hoping to cover will be published shortly, and we'll certainly be drawing that to people's attention. Today, early lessons from the introduction of SIRS in home services, which, as you know, commenced on the 1st of December 2022. And we'll be looking at what kind of notifications have been made since then, by incident type, looking at the rates of reporting, and from a practical perspective, some of the early themes that we have identified through those channels, and looking particularly for the questions that you might have that you want to send in to us. I do also want to draw your attention to a virtual series of workshops that we have launched for SIRS in home care. And the purpose of those workshops is to give workers across a range of different provider types the opportunity of talking and learning about SIRS. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And there is further information about those virtual workshops and how you can enroll, again, on our website. Now, in terms of questions, we've had some which have been pre-submitted. You also, if you're a participant today, have the opportunity of lodging your question live. And if you are interested in doing that, just use the little question mark symbol at the top right of your screen. At the end of the webinar, there is a very short survey that will come onto your screen. We encourage you to complete it. We will look at every survey that's submitted. We are very keen to learn from your feedback on what interests you, what worked for you particularly well through the webinar, what you want more of, so that we can continue doing this and meet your needs. Now, without further delay, I am very pleased to invite Anne Wunsch, who is the Commission's Executive Director for Approvals and Serious Incident Notifications, to start the discussion by talking about the early set of notifications that we have received from home services providers under the newly introduced SIRS. Anne.
Thanks, Janet, and hello, everyone. I'll take you through the 8 notification types, and you should note that this is a presentation about what we've understood about the SIRS Incident Response Scheme since it was introduced on the 1st of December 2022. Now, we received 781 notifications, and a number of those were matters that are not reportable to SIRS. And the majority of those not reportable matters were those that occurred before the 1st of December. So we referred those matters to our complaints area. Other notifications that were not reportable to SIRS were those where the incident did not occur in relation to or as a result of the provision of care and services. And I'll explain this in more detail as I take you through the 8 notification types in descending order of volume, starting with the highest volume type, which is neglect. So neglect, we received 322 notifications to the end of February. The most common examples of this incident type include missed shifts, that is failure to provide care or deliver meals, or a failure to report and or locate a consumer who is not present at the arranged time that service was to be provided. Failure to attend to administer medications, and failure to administer medications during an episode of care. We also saw some examples of failure to detect clinical deterioration and falls. And the example of falls here were where a person falls during a community activity where they're being supervised or supported by a carer, or where a person who is being assisted to shower falls from their shower chair while a staff member is distracted by another task. We also received an example where a consumer who was routinely assisted to mobilise using a four-wheel walker during a community activity attempted to get themselves out of a vehicle before the carer had provided the walker in situ to assist them. The person fell onto a hard surface, required an ambulance, transport to hospital, and was subsequently understood to have sustained a fractured hip. Now, under this notification type, there have been some examples where we've received incidents that were not reportable under SIRS, and examples here were where a consumer had refused care or services. Another example involved where a provider was contacted by a doctor who wanted to report concerns in relation to the consumer's daughter who was allegedly interfering or withholding medications. Now, this information is relevant to the provider as it impacts on the way they engage with the consumer in relation to the delivery of care. But the incident itself was not reportable under SIRS because it didn't occur within the context of, as a result of, or in connection to the delivery of care. However, in this instance, the provider should record this information in their incident management system, as it does impact on the way they understand that consumer and how they might deliver care to that consumer in the future. The second most reported notification type is stealing or financial coercion by a staff member. Now, some providers have told us that they've investigated alleged instances and have not been able to substantiate the allegation, and therefore have not reported to the Commission or to police. It's important to note that allegations and suspicions, as well as confirmed instances, must be reported. Now, the most common example of this notification type includes goods and cash missing from a consumer's home, and where carers are using a consumer's debit or credit card to purchase goods and services for the consumer, are also purchasing items for themselves. All these matters should be reported to the police, and in some instances the Commission has asked providers to report matters to the police. It's important to note that where a reportable incident includes allegations of criminal conduct, there is no discretion available to the provider, and they must report the matter to the police even when the consumer does not want the matter to be pursued. Now, we know from your notifications that theft by a family member, while not reportable under SIRS, may still need to be reported to the police and other relevant authorities. Through our regular engagement with state and territory police services and agencies dealing with elder abuse, we are aware of this issue as an increasing area of risk for older Australians who live longer in their homes with increased frailty and cognitive decline. Now, knowing how keen you are to learn more about how to manage this risk, we'll be providing you with more information in the near future. These matters should also be recorded in your incident management system when you become aware of them or when the consumer advises you of their concerns. Now, moving along to psychological or emotional abuse, the most common incident of this type involves verbal abuse, such as a carer shouting at a consumer or being verbally aggressive. Also, we see instances of aggressive behaviour, such as slamming doors. Providers often report that the consumer has suffered psychological harm from such incidents, but fail to take reasonable steps to treat or manage that harm. And that is, they don't provide us with information that gives us confidence that they are able to prevent reoccurrence. For example, when a consumer reported feeling threatened and intimidated by a male carer, the provider took reasonable steps in counselling the carer, ensuring that the consumer no longer received care and services from that person. However, when the provider reported to us that there was psychological and emotional harm caused to the consumer, they did not identify taking any relevant steps to provide support to that consumer in response to this harm. Now, an example where a matter would not be reportable under SIRS would be where a carer has observed a family member of a consumer criticising or belittling that person. And in this instance, the provider needs to seek support through other agencies such as an advocacy group, an elder abuse hotline, or other state or local organisation, and record their actions in their incident management system. Now, under unreasonable use of force, what we see here is in the course of providing care to a consumer, an example where a carer has noticed bruising on a consumer and knows that there has not been any other visitors to that person's home since a different carer was there on a previous shift. Now, potential causes of bruising can include where a carer physically forces or rushes a reluctant consumer into the shower in order to stay on schedule throughout their shift, or where a carer forcibly or roughly removes a consumer from a room where they're undertaking domestic duties such as vacuuming. One reported example involved also family members who were present during a care episode reporting that skin tears were occurring as a result of rough handling when staff were using a sling in the home environment. Now, an example where force may be considered reasonable is where a carer physically moves or redirects a person to prevent them from having an accident or an immediate injury. And incidents reported to us that are not SIRS notifications include where a consumer's partner or family member has pushed or shoved the consumer. Again, in these circumstances, providers should consider whether other parties such as police need to be informed and record the incident on their incident management system. Missing consumers, and examples here include where carers have provided social support to a person, they've accompanied a person to a shopping centre or to a medical appointment and left the person, the consumer, at the venue and then returned later and been unable to find the person. So the person's been unattended during the course of the medical appointment or during the course of the shopping expedition. We know one instance where the carer then went to the person's home and found the consumer safe and well. And while it wasn't necessary in this instance, providers should consider when it's appropriate to contact the police to ensure that a timely search is undertaken for consumers where that is required. Now, there are some matters that are not reportable, and an example here would be where a consumer is not at home when a worker arrives, say, to perform duties such as gardening. If it's expected that the consumer is usually at home during this gardening experience, it should be the case that workers follow a process of reporting the absence to the provider so that a welfare check can be conducted if necessary. And although the absence has not occurred in the connection with the provision of the gardening service, there's still a responsibility for providers to take reasonable steps to ensure the consumer's safety. Okay, I'll move now to unexpected deaths. And an example here where the Commission took regulatory action involves a circumstance where a carer attended a person's home for a regular service and the consumer didn't respond to the door knock or the phone call. The carer failed to escalate the matter to the provider, and the provider did not have an appropriate escalation process in place. In this instance, the consumer was found unresponsive by police when a welfare check was requested by the family a couple of days later. The consumer died in hospital. The expectation is that providers will have a process in place to contact next of kin and ensure that a welfare check occurs where a consumer appears to not be present at an agreed place and time of care and services. Now, another example is where a consumer was shopping with a carer and experienced a medical episode resulting in their death. Now, because the death occurred in the course of a period of providing care, this was reportable to the Commission. And in this instance, the carer appropriately contacted emergency services and attempted CPR, regrettably without success. There was no reason for the Commission then to take any further action on this matter. Now, matters that have been referred to us that are not reportable incidents include deaths that occur at home, in the community, or in hospital, which are not related to the provision of or omission of care or services. These include examples, for instance, where a staff member is visiting a person's home to provide a regular service and discovers the consumer is deceased. In one instance, a carer attended to provide domestic services and found the consumer drowned in the backyard pool. Of course, emergency services still need to be called and immediate actions taken. Now, in the category of unlawful sexual contact or inappropriate sexual conduct, we mostly saw incidents where a consumer alleged that a carer had made sexually suggestive comments or requests or inappropriately touched or attempted to kiss a consumer. One reported incident involved a carer indecently exposing themselves to a consumer. Another reported incident involved a consumer alleging that a carer sexually assaulted her while showering her, causing pain and discomfort. Now, in this case, the provider immediately contacted the police and attended the consumer's home to offer comfort and support. The staff member was immediately suspended from duty, and that all makes sense on the face of it. But the incident notification submitted by the provider indicated that no physical impact and there was only minor psychological injury or discomfort, which was resolved without formal interventions. And that description itself contradicts the consumer's account of the incident. So it's vital that when providers assess impact, they consider whether an incident of this type could reasonably have been expected to have caused harm. So in terms of the Commission's response, the SIRS team formally requested additional information from the provider and also referred the matter for consideration to our Code of Conduct team. Now, an example of a matter that would not be reportable under SIRS involves an incident where a consumer was behaving in a sexually inappropriate way towards staff. Now, an incident of this type should still be managed through the provider's incident management system using behaviour support strategies with the consumer as appropriate. And depending on the circumstances, it may be appropriate for the provider to report such an incident to the police. In another reported incident that was not reportable under SIRS, a consumer alleged that a neighbour attended her home, sexually assaulted her when he gave her a massage for her sore back. The service contacted police appropriately. SIRS team is considering whether other actions are appropriate. The details of this incident indicate the consumer was considerably distressed. However, when the provider reported minor psychological injury or discomfort, resolved without formal interventions, this does not appear consistent with the details of the incident. So once again, we'd encourage providers to further consider this aspect, regardless of whether the matter is reportable under SIRS. Now, if I move to the last notification type, inappropriate use of restrictive practices, we've received 3 notifications, one each of physical, chemical and environmental restraint. One of these incidents involves a consumer who was resistant to personal care, resulting in a carer physically restraining the consumer to allow a second carer to undress and shower the person. There was no behaviour support plan detailed in the consumer's care plan. The family reported to the provider that the consumer was distressed and complained about the restrictive treatment. This notification was also referred to our Code of Conduct team in the Commission. Another incident involved a consumer being administered risperidone for agitation without appropriate consents in place, which was identified through an audit process. This matter was raised with the consumer's GP, who ceased the medication with good effect. In another incident, a provider conducted an annual review of the consumer's file, and during that audit identified that staff were locking the security door to the property when they finished providing care and services at the direction of the family. The provider appropriately took steps to understand what provisions were in place, including civil and administrative tribunal authorisations, such as guardianship for the consumer. And one example of an incident reported to us that was not reportable under SIRS involved family members locking the consumer in their room to prevent wandering. Now, in this instance, the service contacted the police to conduct a welfare check and also contacted the consumer's GP. The provider also noted no impact to the consumer in this incident. But we know, as we've heard from many services, that staff are often very distressed by these circumstances and have contacted us for further information and advice. Now, I'll just move to my next slide, which will just set out for you the numbers of notifications that have been sent to the Commission, and it helps you see the numbers per provider, and what we see here is we still have fairly low reporting, and we are using the opportunity of this webinar to talk to you about the need to engage with the scheme, noting that we have large numbers on this webinar, and many of you to date probably have not yet submitted a SIRS notification. Please use this opportunity to understand your obligations, and thank you. And back to next presenter. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you, Anne. An enormous amount of information that has just come through there. I think what I'll do is go straight to Dr. Melanie Wroth, the Commission's Chief Clinical Advisor. Melanie, I think you're going to pick up some of the key themes that Anne touched upon as she went through each of the 8 reportable incident types, and possibly drawing out some of the really important practical considerations, including the ways in which we're expecting providers and workers to assess impact. So over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, Janet. Some of the, the main point I wanted to discuss in a bit more detail generally is incident management. And it has to be really thought of properly, completely, rather than just a reflex response to what's happening. So incident management involves a process to assess the immediate response to an incident, which may in clinical issues include first aid, for example, if somebody's bleeding or if there's a burn, if they're unconscious, if CPR is needed, if there's a blood sugar problem, etc. You can fill in many gaps yourself there. An incident needs then to be recorded thoroughly and accurately and investigated. And obviously the investigation needs to happen as soon as possible, so that the people that you talk to in relation to this investigation, it's very clear in their memory still, and a record of this investigation needs to occur. And fundamentally what you're doing is answering the question, how could this incident have happened? Should we have predicted it? How can we avoid it happening again? And that would be to the same or different consumer and the same or a similar incident. So it's not just a matter of recording and reporting, it's a whole lot more than that. In looking at how this could have happened, you need to try and understand what all the contributors are. So not just the main one. Is it in a situation where there was a perfect storm, where there were a number of problematic things that all came together so that there were really no risk mitigation things around the consumer's care? And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Swiss cheese idea, but was this incident because of a Swiss cheese problem where any number of safeguards could have been in place, but none of them actually were? It has to take into account such things as the person's condition, had that changed, staff awareness of a person's individual needs and situation, staff actions or lack of actions. Was this in relation to the skills or education of staff? Is it a staff conduct matter or a staff management matter? A matter about the environment of the consumer? Were escalation processes effective, and were these attended to properly? And could any of these risks have been identified in advance, or should they have? And if they weren't, why weren't they? And how could they in the future? You need to try and understand as best you can what happened, especially if a consumer has got cognitive impairment or some form of dementia. That will give them the best opportunity for good recall. And you need to speak to all involved rather than just getting one side of the story, if you like. So identifying all of the things that may have contributed, you need to be inclusive. You almost need to think a little bit creatively, or at least actively think about it. So in the case of a fall, it may be that there are many things that came together for that person. It may be that they were slightly unwell that day, that they weren't supervised as closely as they should have been, that they're inclined to have impulsive behaviour, that they weren't wearing their glasses, that their mobility aids were not in reach, or that they were rushing to go to the toilet when they should have been taken a bit earlier. So all of these things will identify opportunities to change or modify what happened then, and just to make sure that doesn't happen again next time. And then how will you check that these modifications that you put in place have actually occurred? You need to also look at what actions were taken in relation to seeking advice, or who you notify, who you communicate with. Obviously, there needs to be some form of open disclosure that both occurs and is recorded, and that will always involves communication with the consumer, but it may well involve family members, a social worker, a GP, etc. when you want to escalate matters. You need to decide whether or not it needs to be reported under the SIRS scheme or to police, or whether you need to discuss it with an abuse hotline, or whether sexual assault services need to be contacted and engaged. I just want to talk a little bit more about assessing harm. In general, we see that providers are reasonably good at assessing physical harm, where you see bruises, or where the person's complaining of pain, or where there's been an obvious injury such as a skin tear or a fracture. But it's important to remember that physical harm can also be delayed, where you probably had yourself, you fall over and the next day you notice that you've got a lump or a bump somewhere, or that something's painful that normally isn't. You can certainly have internal bleeding, and where there's been a head injury, you need to take special care, because delayed response to a head injury where you might slide into unconsciousness later needs to be taken into account. And the other thing is assessing psychological impact. That there's quite a cognitive bias when you assess assess psychological impact, because you don't want to have caused harm to the person. You would likely feel that you're supporting them and sympathising with them at the time. But you do need to remember that the person may have lasting issues with fear of strangers, fear of carers, trust in you as a provider, guilt that they may have contributed to it, and they may suffer significant social withdrawal, depression, loss of consciousness, changing their habits, loss of independence, and severing of relationships. And it's really important to assess that in relation to the individual. So their particular background, what's happened in the past, both recent and distant, cultural considerations, religious considerations, and of course being aware of past trauma, where a trauma-informed approach is so important. And I just wanted to also talk about dementia, where assessing the impact in people with dementia is sometimes problematic, where people might not remember the incident for very long or not remember it at all, or where they're unable to find the words to properly articulate things to you. That does not mean there has been no impact. So just because you don't remember that you were distressed doesn't mean that the physiological, or that the distress didn't happen, and that the physiological effects don't persist long after the memory of the actual event. And it may affect your future responses and behaviour. And also, just because you have not been able to substantiate the allegation does not mean it didn't happen. That is really important. So always keep in your mind that it could have happened. And even if you don't think it did, that may reflect your own long-term knowledge or like of a particular carer, or your desire for it not to have happened. So even if you can't substantiate the allegation, you need to put your mind to minimising the risk of it ever happening again, just in case it did happen. And think to yourself, what if it did happen? What should I be doing to stop it happening again? And where staff are abusing in some way a consumer, remember that this might be either opportunistic or predatory, and both of those situations need a different risk management response. But in either case, think about who the ideal victim is. Think about the issue of grooming. The ideal victim is somebody who's alone with staff in their home, and or who is cognitively impaired in some way, as in living with dementia, or they're sight or hearing impaired, or they're suggestible, and that they've come to be very dependent on a particular personality. So those issues are all situations in which it's very easy to financially or sexually abuse a consumer. Just very briefly, in relation to neglect, given that we've seen quite a lot of that being reported, that's something that we did see coming up in COVID as well, where there was, in some cases, quite a few missed episodes of care. Very important that somebody is able to identify consumers who will be at risk of harm if there's a missed episode of care, whether that's medication, food, or personal care, getting somebody out of bed, so that people can be redirected to make sure that people who are highly dependent on care are not the ones that are missing out if you're short of staff. I might leave it there, Janet, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melanie. And another tour de force. I think we have been treated to a very, very comprehensive survey of the implications of SIRS in home services through both Anne's and Melanie's presentations. And I suspect there may be some of you watching today who will go to our website and find this recording and watch it again, just to ensure that you're grabbing all those insights, of which there are many. And we have a third in the trio, and I'm very pleased to introduce to all of you Mark Backhouse, who, as I said at the outset, is the Manager of Quality and Compliance for Catholic Homes. And Mark comes to us with the provider perspective on the implementation of SIRS in home services and some of his early experiences and those of the workers in the service in which he operates. So Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So Catholic Homes is a provider in Western Australia. We provide home and community care as well as residential care. And as Janet mentioned, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of our journey through the SIRS process. So I guess the first thing we looked at was trying to understand the differences between residential and home care. And as it's been mentioned today, you know, there's 3 types different, and 5 are the same within the guidance material. And some of those included SIRS being only occurs during the service or a result of a failure to provide a service, or alternatively, not during the time of a service, but as a result of poor service provision around neglect and the missed services. The other one that we did look at was unexplained absence, which is in residential care, and then over to missing consumers, so a bit of a differentiation there as well. What's the same? So really bringing it back to the impact to the resident, to the client or the resident, and the services and support for the person. A big one, it has been mentioned today, is not just looking at the clinical side, but also making sure we're looking at the emotional and psychological support for our clients, which is often something that gets missed, and really concentrating in on the well-being of that person. Staying in line with the same processes around incident management for both, which I'll come back to, and just looking at open disclosure, obviously, within that incident management process. So what did we need to do to prepare? Sorry, it's back to the other slide. Previous slide, yep. So keeping with our incident management system, at the moment it's currently paper-based, but looking at further improvements there. But also really honing in on our policy and procedures. So looking at our existing incident management policies and updating them. Our new SIRS policies were developed to help guide staff around the management of SIRS. And training and education for staff, so extremely important. And looking at ways of which we could train our staff, not just online training, but looking at more interactive training with theory into practice sessions and giving them some workshop-based training. Resources available, so obviously utilising heavily the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission decision reporting tool, which we use for all suspected and alleged SIRS. And we do save a copy of that tool, so we have evidence going forward as well. The guidance material within the Commission's website, and networking in with other providers is always important, because we're in it together and just learning from other providers and how they found things and challenges. How have we ensured compliance? So having robust organisational governance processes in place, and then effective escalation processes for the team in the field. So different team leaders within the field were allocated to respond to SIRS, and then escalating that up to our quality team. Contractor and volunteer compliance. So really preferred contractors were sent guidance material, given some information, and we're currently looking at an investigation electronic application on our contractor phones, just to assist with communication, feedback and escalation. Next slide, please. So, as I said, incident management. So keeping with the same incident management tool. So the first one, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, is number one, making sure we have a leadership and a safety culture, and effective governance system, step one. Responding to an incident and the immediate needs of those affected. And recording and reporting incidents. So understanding what occurred and what steps do we need to take. Analysing the incident, so what happened, and part of this could be looking at a root cause analysis for the incident, if it was a significant impact or a systemic issue that has gone across multiple areas within the organisation and within the service. Step 5, looking at implementation actions from that root cause analysis or from the incident, and then closing the loop, and of course looking at open disclosure with the client and the families. From this, all of this is fed through to our clinical governance committee from a medium level, and then up to the board, who are quite involved in all levels of incident management and SIRS, and really want to know the nitty-gritty of everything, which is good. Next slide, please. So reflection and challenges. So after hours staffing support, always a big one. So really, again, as I mentioned, having the staff having a good understanding of SIRS, and employment of subject matter experts within the home and community care team. And we created additional roles. So we looked at a clinical quality lead, pre-SIRS, and post-SIRS, we've looked at a quality support staff member to assist in additional workload associated with reporting and compliance. Both are on 24-hour call, really to make sure that the escalation process is there and you have that person that can report up. And collaboration with residential care and home and community care, just to share learnings and updates across SIRS. The grey ones, no, I'm not referring to the clients. So really it's thinking about those incidents that we weren't sure about. And then if we weren't sure about it, it was in doubt, report. That was kind of our approach. But now I think it's shifting where we're looking at more tightening that control and having a bit of understanding rather than just reporting everything. So getting a better understanding of things. Workload and maintaining compliance. So quality teams, as I've mentioned, working across home and community care and just seeking feedback and advice from each other, and staying up to date with changes associated with the reforms and as per changes to the quality care principles, which obviously are coming thick and fast at the moment, as we all know. Lessons learned. So what have we done to improve our systems and processes? So really educating staff on the importance of communication when they can't attend a service and bring it back to neglect, as Anne mentioned. So looking at preventing a SIRS from occurring if they can just notify the client before the service time. And I think this has been the main challenge, and obviously a lot of reports have gone through. Being critical of our systems and processes, and looking at how can we improve, how can we learn more, seeking feedback and participating in webinars like this one today, workshops and networking with other providers. Where to from here? So continuous improvement processes. So as I've mentioned, we're looking at a new client and risk management systems at the moment, and just seeking ways we can be more innovative and just improving and tightening the process. Keeping up to date with the reforms, and building a culture of trust and support with our team, but also with the Commission, and being able to reach out to the Commission services, the SIRS team, which have been really helpful in learning, what is this a SIRS or isn't it a SIRS? What sort of information do you need? And probably the last thing is just really ongoing learning of SIRS. And I think that's not just home and community care, but it's residential care, and just having a better understanding, because we're still learning things on a daily basis. Yeah, but it's been a good journey so far. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant, Mark. Thank you. And thank you so much for that thoughtful perspective from the provider point of view. I'm going to stay with you for the first question in our Q&A session. And thank you, everyone, for the questions you've submitted. Keep them coming. We have some really good ones here that I will fire back at the panel members. But Mark, we've now been doing this for 3 months, although with Christmas in the middle of that. A question without notice, but just on the top of your head, is there anything you would have done differently over the last 3 months? Would you have started a different place? It sounds to me like your process of preparation and implementation has been pretty thorough. But does anything occur to you that if somebody were at an earlier stage of their journey that you might want to share with them as a lesson learned that you've not already shared with us?
Sure. I think going back to what I said is networking with other providers. I think it's only now that we're starting to reach out to others and get a better understanding of things. And, it's easy to stay in those silos. It's good to reach out to other providers and have an understanding. And then also reaching out to the Commission SIRS team and getting some feedback from the horse's mouth, if I can say that. It's just to get an idea of what is the expectation, because it can be a little bit varied. And as I said, the grey ones are a little bit tricky. And I've seen that in residential and both sides. So it's just having an understanding of both. And maybe even getting our policies and procedures done a little bit quicker, or there's probably lots of things. That's
good. I know that, again, some really useful advice for those listening. Let me go to some of the questions which have been submitted. There are so many to choose from. And you talked about missed shifts and that being a high risk for the serious incident type of neglect. Amanda's put in the question, does being unable to provide services to a client due to staff shortages come under neglect? Now, I suspect you'll start your answer with, well, it depends. But do you want to just elaborate briefly to indicate the disposition of the Commission in that regard?
We understand the context and the operating environment you're in, but we would expect that you would have a way of understanding the risk associated with each individual client or consumer and prioritise your services based on those risk assessments. And we would expect that where you did report a matter because you were unable to deliver a meal or provide a service, that you would have a way of being able to describe the impact for that person, and therefore demonstrate that you were risk rating this and prioritising individuals. That's the kind of engagement we would expect to see through a serious incident notification.
Okay, all right. I'm going to stay with you. Key's put a question in here. If the staff don't want to report a matter to the police, does the provider still have to, if in the scheme of things it would be reportable to police? What's the story there?
Absolutely. The obligation is with the provider. So it's the provider's obligations in relation to the serious incident response scheme. So the provider does need to report, and it would we would expect that a more senior person in the service, other than a staff member that was delivering care, would be probably engaged in that reporting to police and would need to be well informed about the matter in order to provide the police with useful information that they would need to understand potential criminal conduct.
Okay. Now I have another question in relation to falls, and Anne, I'm putting you on notice. I'll come back to you. It's in relation to which, does it qualify as a serious incident type, and what would we expect to see coming through as a reportable incident in relation to falls in home services? But Melanie, perhaps you first. And the question I have for you, you spent a little bit of time talking to us about impact and the assessment of impact on consumers. Can you just take us back into that? Because we hear often that if people have a degree of cognitive impairment and therefore become unreliable witnesses to what has happened, or indeed the effect it has had on them, how are you looking for aged care workers to approach that sort of dilemma?
So specifically in people with cognitive impairment, obviously that's a complete spectrum, and some people with mild cognitive impairment can still give a really good account of things and can still remember things that have happened, particularly things that are shocking to them in some way. So don't use the diagnosis as a reason not to engage with the consumer. The other thing is that, of course, there are non-verbal cues. So where somebody's behaviour has changed, or where they're giving you non-verbal indications that there's some sort of a problem. If they're reluctant to do something that they would previously do, you might well seek to understand a bit more closely if they've got pain somewhere. You might need to assess them much more closely than you would by saying to somebody that's not got dementia, does everything hurt? Can you get up and walk and show me? You might really do a top-to-toe assessment of them in more detail, and looking for bruising as well as looking for signs of pain and distress. As far as psychological impact goes, I would be looking at any changes in behaviour which may be subtle initially and may be brief or may be persistent. But the way to do that is really to say, if this happened to me, what might I be feeling? Because somebody's feelings and emotions are not extinguished by a diagnosis of dementia. So I would start by being reasonable and being inquisitive and being thorough.
And that goes to the definition of the priority one. And people, some of you may have this in front of you or be able to quote parts of it, but a priority one reportable incident is one that has caused or could reasonably have been expected to have caused a consumer physical or psychological injury and or discomfort that requires medical or psychological treatment to resolve. Now, it's an incredibly complicated sentence, but the or could reasonably have been expected to have caused is also encompasses the near misses, where something was just avoided or occurred, and it may be somewhat difficult in the context to attribute a particular impact to the consumer, but you can have a reasonable expectation that there would have been some psychological or physical harm associated with that incident. And you have to exercise judgment about the extent to which that applies in a particular circumstance, and therefore whether you would categorise it as a priority one or a priority two, which essentially is anything that doesn't fall into that first priority category.
In relation to could reasonably have expected to have caused harm.
Yes.
That's the near miss that's your best friend. Because if somebody falls over and doesn't break anything and doesn't bruise anything, and you can fix all of the things that led to them having that fall, and thereby avoiding in the future the actual harm, then that is really where your incident management has prevented harm.
Absolutely, and it goes back to the diagram that Mark had in his slides, the incident management system cycle, that continuous improvement loop. Whereas Melanie says something goes wrong, you analyse it, you understand what could have been and should have been done differently, and you put into place the corrective strategy to avoid it being repeated and therefore anyone else potentially coming to harm. And that is fundamental to what we hope will be the ultimate effectiveness of the serious incident response scheme in reducing the incidence and prevalence of risk and harm to consumers, because providers are learning how better to mitigate risk as they go about delivering care. All right, Anne, your turn. Falls. Can you give us a précis of the way in which we see falls coming through in serious incident notifications, and the ways in which we're expecting providers of home services to understand, risk assess, and make decisions about reporting of falls where consumers are involved, please?
Okay, thanks, Janet. I know that this is a vexed issue for providers, that they are unclear about the falls that should be reported as serious incidents against falls more generally, which occur in consumers' lives. The essential differential that I want you to focus on is, did the fall occur in the context of or as a result of or in connection to the care and services that are being delivered? For example, is a fall associated with a failure to administer medication, or is a fall associated with a provision of domestic assistance where the person slipped on a floor while it was being mopped by a carer, because the carer failed to support the person to remain outside of the space where the wet floor was during that period of domestic assistance. These matters are relevant to SIRS. If, for example, a person is out in the garden walking around and falls over while the carer is inside vacuuming, etc., that fall is not related to the domestic assistance being provided in the house. So that's not reportable under SIRS. But we encourage you, if you are unsure about whether falls matters are relevantly reported under SIRS or not, to contact our SIRS team and discuss these matters, because it will assist you to determine which ones are outside of the scope. Now, it could be that where a staff member is accompanying a person in the community and the person falls because they have stumbled as they're walking along. There's no obvious problem with the way that the carer engaged with the person during the walking, and the carer also provided the appropriate support after the person fell. It's still appropriately reported under SIRS. And it's important to note that these matters are serious incidents, and that's what the scheme is about. That is reporting serious incidents and the responses that you provide to those incidents. So sometimes it's still relevant to report, even if there was nothing that the worker could have done differently to change the outcome of the event. Once again, it's important to try and distinguish between falls more broadly, which are not reportable, and falls that are specifically reportable because they've occurred in the context of, as a result of, or at the time that care was being delivered.
Okay, let me just stay with that notion then of reportable versus not reportable. And your slide went to this same point. And we have, and unsurprisingly, we have received a number of notifications which we've evaluated and decided were probably not reportable within the scope of the scheme, but may have nonetheless required the provider to take certain actions. So we need to distinguish very clearly between what is expected of a provider under an incident management system and what is notifiable to the Commission. But just staying with that, are we providing feedback to providers where we find a notification to be not reportable in order that we can assist the home services providers to start understanding better how that differentiation plays out?
Yes, we are. We're providing feedback on matters that are not reportable and giving the reasons why. And I'm also using this opportunity of this webinar to suggest to you all to use our inquiries staff to seek to understand matters that you're not sure about whether they're reportable or not. Because we only have still fairly low numbers of notifications, we know that there are many, many services out there who need to really engage with these matters and start reporting. We really want to support you and encourage you to report the right matters, but we're saying if you're not sure and you report, there is no problem with that. We'll give you feedback, but please also contact us.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. What happens in the circumstance where a family member believes that they witness or identify what they think is a reportable incident, but they ask the provider and the provider says, no, we don't think that's reportable and we're not going to take that action. Now, we do have a complaints resolution function as well. So do you just want to talk briefly about the ways in which we have different ways of understanding what's happening for consumers, and that our complaints channel is a parallel process?
Sure. And we've received complaints from family members and consumers where they have taken a view that the incident that impacted on them should have been reported, and they followed it up with the provider and note that it wasn't reported as a serious incident. So those family members or consumers can contact us through our complaints area through the 1800 number, 1800 951 822, or go onto our website and then use the online form for contacting us. We also note that some providers have prepared their own materials and circulated them to families and consumers about how they engage with the serious incident response scheme. But where we find a provider has not reported and we understand it through a complaint, we will contact that provider and seek to understand why they didn't report the serious incident through the scheme.
All right, well done. That brings us to very close to the end of time, so I'll round off the questioning on that note. We haven't managed to get to all the questions that were submitted, so thank you everyone for being enthusiastic about that. We will provide information on our website to ensure that we cover off the questions that we didn't get to. Please stay online after I complete this exercise, because there will be a survey I mentioned earlier, and we would very much appreciate it if you would fill it in order that we can hear back from you directly on how today has gone for you. Thank you particularly to Anne, Melanie and Mark. I think that you have served up a smorgasbord of information that will take some time to digest, and I think we'll send a couple of people back to our website for a further look. Please recall and take advantage of the virtual workshops that I mentioned earlier in the session on SIRS in home services. If you would like to involve yourself in some active learning experiences, you can find out more about them on the Commission's website. Look for education in their workshops. And once again, keep an eye out for or sign up to our media channels and also our quality bulletin, which are other ways that you can hear about the work we're doing and the ways in which we are seeking to support you to be high-performing providers, including in relation to managing and preventing serious incidents to your consumers. A video recording of this webinar will be available on our website as well, so please check it out if you want to refresh your memory about any of the ground we've covered. Thank you to my panelists, And thank you to the participants for joining us over the course of this hour. Take care. Bye-bye.